There's a lot of overlap, even if you're not in that world, things that are relevant in terms of communication and self-awareness. It's amazing how much personal development comes into these topics. There's something in there for people outside of that working world.
Hello everyone, Joe Espana here. I'm about to launch season 2 of the GOBO podcast and thought I'd do a little introduction with my producer Claire Gallagher. In case you don't know, or forgotten, or frankly don't care, GOBO stands for Glimpses of the Blindingly Obvious. As Claire says, it's like standing right in front of trees and not noticing it's wood. Anyway, Claire and I mulled over the upcoming season and give you a sneak preview of our guests and our highlights. Hope you enjoy. Thank you for joining me again, Claire.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Joe.
Boy, it's amazing how the years disappeared, and I've crammed quite a lot during the year. I'm really quite excited to have this conversation, to get your take as the producer on season 2. I can't believe we're saying season 2.
I definitely feel like it feels really natural. Other shows that speak to these kinds of topics, they can feel a little dry at times or overly academic. I feel like you are just actually keen on having a really interesting conversation, and I think that has come through in these episodes. Let's talk specifically about a couple of the episodes. For the people listening, since we're naming a lot of people here, but these are the episodes that will follow this one. So like in each case, we're kind of giving a little bit of context and how the thread has led through. In terms of the conversation you had with Anthony and leadership in dispersed teams, I found the idea of water cooler moments very interesting. So what's your specific takeaway from the conversation with Anthony?
It brought a couple of ideas even more into relief. Our experience of COVID seems to have accelerated a load of stuff with teams, leadership, how people work, what they think of work, and all sorts of stuff. Accelerated all those ideas that were probably in the background and sort of trucking along. This idea of thinking about when your people, if you're the team leader and your people are not with you in the office, they're not with you, they're dispersed, etc., or a hybrid version of that. Something he said struck a bell with me, the notion of people having to think, in these circumstances, what are we actually losing? What's the thing that's now missing that would have been there before? And one of the things, and you've mentioned it, the water cooler moment, those social interactions, like how are you doing? How was your weekend? That kind of thing. It kind of is a bit of glue that creates a sense of belonging. I belong to this team. The reality is that leaders can't just keep doing more of the same, just sort of cranking it all up. I'm going to communicate more because people are not with me. And I haven't got as easy opportunities to communicate. So I'm going to communicate more Zoom calls, more Teams calls, that kind of thing. It's not just doing more. It's about doing things differently, and the requirements are different. So that's one of the things that the conversation with Anthony really brought out. Reinforcing the human-to-human relationships is really tough when you've got dispersed teams. The world today has moved on rapidly, and we can't just keep doing what we've always done. You've got to think about it completely different. One final point on that is the notion of the emotional connection that people might have with the people that they work with. Some more than others, obviously. And so if you translate that into organization speak, it's the emotional culture that may or may not exist in the team. There was something I read yesterday, and it's just a stat, which said that only 28% of hybrid workers feel connected to their organization's culture. So my question is, for those who do feel connected and they're working in a dispersed or hybrid fashion, what are they doing to make them feel connected? Because the rest of them aren't feeling connected.
Yeah. And it's that question of, is your sense of loyalty, belonging, ownership of your job, is it the fact that you have an office to go to and a desk that you always sit at and a mug that you usually use? Is that these small little details, physical presence aspects, they're not the be all and end all, and And like my next question was the conversation with Gethin, which is about well-being at work. And none of these conversations can be removed from the context of COVID. Maybe lots of these questions were bubbling under the surface for maybe many years. How much of Anthony's conversation feeds into Gethin's conversation about well-being in the workplace culture?
So if I had to identify a theme for all the episodes, really, was sort of an exploration of what does it mean to go to work?
Mm,
And there's so many facets to this. So a clear connection between Anthony and Gethin is thinking about what does an individual or a team need in order to feel satisfied, fulfilled, and sort of enjoying what they're doing and feeling connected. The angle of attack in those two episodes was slightly different because obviously Gethin was thinking about, and we were talking about the notion of well-being. And well, something I thought was really interesting. He said that none of the research ends up with a definitive description or definition of well-being. Yeah, we've
yeah.
all got, so there's all sorts of different versions of it. The connection between Anthony and Gethin, I think, is this, that work, just what it's like to work in the 21st century. I know that everybody's worked really hard in the past, but people are really maxed out. I mean, it's really busy. There's tons to do. And so Anthony was kind of talking about what does that look like when you're not actually together with people, you know, and rubbing shoulders and maybe having lunch together or grabbing a sandwich or a coffee. That's one aspect. Gethin was really saying, do you know what? There's so much going on. Well-being has become a more conscious thing because we've known for years what it takes to create happiness at work, but everything we've done up to this point and still continuing is about fixing people. And, you know, what we haven't thought about maybe enough is the caveat, maybe enough, is that people have all sorts of and different stressors within their personal life or work context. Organizations haven't really cracked that nut or come up with the answer that says, how do we look after people in a way that they're operating at their optimum? So in what Gethin talks about, which I think is a brilliant way of looking at it, is how do we give them resources, enough resources, personal resources, to be able to cope with all these personal work stresses? And as you say, you know, again, this comes up in other episodes, but if you're working dispersed, that might be fantastic for some people and might be less fantastic for others. So there's a whole load of potential stresses there, but there might be a whole load of other things that are happening in our lives that, you know, up to this point, well-being initiatives have been about fixing things as opposed to building people's personal resources in order to be able to cope with all the stuff they've got to do and the expectations of the organizations. Yeah, that's the connections that I saw.
I find it interesting as well. That definitely leads into Richard's conversation. All of these conversations, it's a post-COVID environment. Things are changing and still changing. I guess they always have been changing, but things have been accelerated in recent years. What can we learn from the changes as they come up? Because I think there's a lot of people having to think on their feet. In Richard Hurd's episode, we're talking about why teams aren't working, the quality or the approach of leadership in
Yeah.
dispersed, hybrid, and any other kind of teams, the role of well-being in workplaces, and the cohesiveness and effectiveness of teams in these high stress moments, no matter what those stressors are. And I think it was in Richard's episode, he talked about a crisis moment and people pull together and get things done. And he makes the point that I found fascinating, and I've talked about it a number of times with friends in the meantime. When you're in a crisis moment, creativity is lost, connection is lost, everything
Totally.
just for survival. And I think reacting to changes as they come up and reacting to global crises and a lot of stressors is creativity being lost. What can we do to retain that? And also connection is being lost. And that kind of is a kind of a linchpin of a lot of team effectiveness, effective leadership. Just to point to Richard's episode, the cohesiveness of teams in terms of like the leadership, which is kind of a thread that leads through this entire series. In terms of the current climate and the future of work, as Gethin talks about, what impact do you think crisis has on teams and in leadership of teams?
Well, I would do it the other way around, actually.
Yeah,
I would say the cohesion of the team is how much that cohesion exists in the team and how they work together has a direct impact on the team's ability to deal with crises or where things go wrong, where they have to be more adaptable, be more creative in finding answers. There was research done some years ago where senior leaders, very senior managers, or the exec were being asked, what's your perception of team working in your team? Senior leaders believed that the team that they were leading wasn't firing on all cylinders. So they were okay, they were good, they were producing everything else, but there was a gap, they weren't high performing. What I thought was interesting when you read further into the research, they asked how important the notion of team working is to deliver the results and aspirations as a business. And 95% of these senior leaders said, oh, it's mega important. We need high performing teams and cohesive teams in order to deliver both for our customers and our shareholders and everything else. Well, there's a mismatch between how important it's seen and the level of performance around it. It would be a mistake to say that managerial teams and above are really tight, really cohesive, really producing to the max. They're not. I pick up that point again with Gary Blissett later on in the series when we talk about conflict in teams.
yeah.
If you've got a team that's not really tight and cohesive, the chances are they're not delving into things deeply enough. One other aspect of teams is the design of organizations. Literally the org chart
Yeah.
doesn't help because I'll give you a specific example of what I mean. Let's assume you work in a call center. You're taking calls for, I don't know, for a utility firm. If I went into that business and I asked the HR director, can I have a look at your org chart? You will find the various teams in the call center organized as teams, right? But the individual people in those teams are just doing individual work. There's very little interdependency. If you've got more than one team in the department, these people are working individually. So the notion of team, I think Richard talked about this, is and he referenced a book that we both like, which says that some teams aren't really teams. They're just a group of people that
Yeah.
are under a org chart that says, you're a member of this team because it's convenient to label you that way. So this whole notion of team working and what that means and how do you push up the level of performance, it creates mega issues for, I think, for the leaders of the team and how they manage all of that and how people feel about it.
The thing that I generally take away from these episodes is the passion that you guys all have for your work and the study that is involved in this work as well. When we spoke about what this is all about, it's about sharing these glimpses of the blindingly obvious that are often not obvious to the person who's not tuned in, which goes back to a lot of the things you were saying. People in crisis don't tune in. This podcast is an intention of sharing insights and nuggets of wisdom. A lot of your guests have these little aha moments. If you were to go ahead and send a message out to leaders, but also people who help leaders to do better at their jobs from a career like your own that has seen a lot of change, What would be a key thing that is often overlooked? What would be one of those things?
Well, the one that pops to my mind straight away, and it's something that I talk a lot with clients about, is I'd press the pause button from
Mm.
time to time. And the reason for that is simple. The feeling of work, because of deadlines, everything else, is we've got a lot to do in a short time. So it's hurry up, hurry up, hurry up. And the thing is, there's another connection with your friend and now mine, the wonderful Deirdre. She was just brilliant. Major connection with her because one thing that emerged in her conversation, and I think is absolutely pertinent to my answer about pressing the pause button, is if you don't, as a leader, if you don't pause and reflect, you're not making your best decisions. And this thing about why I called it GOBO, glimpses of the blindingly obvious, is because the other analogy is the wood for the trees. It's in our face, but we don't press the pause button enough to go, okay, hold on a minute, what's going on here? What kind of tree, if I mix my metaphors a minute,
Mm.
what kind of tree is in front of me? And by the way, what's it all mean? Because we're just always on the hurry up. So that would be, if I were coaching somebody today, I'd be going, you know, what time do you engineer for yourself to take stock, reflect on what's going on and, the component factors, and then help you to decide what's your next move? Let's slow down for just a second so that we can hurry up later. My tip is press the pause button more often than you're doing right now.
Yeah, and that is true outside of work also in life. So this
Definitely.
example of these things that you talk about is good for leadership and good for effective teams and high performing teams, but it's also just good advice for
Yeah.
people.
You have to recharge the batteries at a personal level sometime, but you can't burn the candle at both ends forever. The wick eventually runs out, right? Definitely.
It's so true in your coaching and consulting practices. How can a leader take a pause when everything is on fire?
Yeah, so it's really difficult, and I think there's we've got to take into account another factor, which I think, when I think about it, Julie Smith kind of touched on. The problem is really difficult to take a pause because there's so much landing on our lap. I've got stuff to do and deadlines to meet. The other reason it's difficult to press the pause button is because of the little voice in our own head. So the little voice in our head creates a bit of doubt, so it's easier to take an action, do something rather than pause and think it through. If that voice is saying, I've got to know the answer, and if somebody asks me, I'm the leader here, so, and I've got years of experience. There's a really great book. One of my favorite authors around all this subject is a psychologist called Adam Grant, and he wrote a book where he talks about the problem with knowing. Now, that self-speak of I'm now in charge, I'm now the leader of this situation, etc., etc. There's a crisis moment. I've got loads of experience. Of course, I know what I've got to do next. But could there be a different version of the story? If you don't press that pause button and get into a conversation with your team, you'll probably do what you've done before or some version of it. And that may or may not work in this new crisis situation. The history of business and organizations is littered with disasters where the pause button wasn't pressed for whatever reason.
I use quite a lot in my own work as well. I wouldn't refer to it as a pause, but a zoom out.
Yeah,
It's like it feeds into your metaphor of the woods for the tree, like it's right in front of you and
yeah,
it's watch. And I think with the tools and the communication capacity available to us today, this has to happen now. This has to happen yesterday. This has to be delivered, approved, financed. All of these things, they can happen quickly, but just because they can happen quickly doesn't mean they need to happen immediately because you can end up halfway down the wrong road because you didn't take that pause or you didn't
yeah.
zoom out to get that perspective. And I think that's good advice for work, life, and everything in between. it's perspective, but when you are moving so fast, things are blurred. You know, if you're driving fast in a car or flying down a hill on your bike, things are blurred and whizzing by.
Yeah.
Can't see them in full focus until you pause and have a look around and assess the situation. For leaders who are under a lot of pressure and leaders who are maybe new to roles, and I have to show that I can perform, I can hit the ground running, I can handle this, and they don't want to show that weakness. And in like vulnerability in leadership is something that was spoken about in the first season as well. For anybody who hasn't listened to season one, it's excellent.
Ah,
No,
thanks, Claire. Thanks for the plug.
it was mentioned a few times that vulnerability in leadership and showing that vulnerability, and it's almost a sign of confidence and capability, like being capable, that you can say, no, this needs to stop right now. And that there's a maturity in that, it's the leadership maturity in that it's not being afraid to look like I need to take a break because I can't handle this. It's like showing vulnerability as a sign of strong leadership. And I think that hitting the pause button, it's how we see these glimpses of the blindingly obvious, because otherwise they're just blurred.
I think you're absolutely right. This analogy of taking the bigger picture for a moment, I think it's really
Yeah.
important. And all this stuff, how we kind of talk to ourselves, our sense of self-confidence, everything else, that overlapped massively with Deirdre's episode. It also overlapped with Gary's in the sense that, well, what we were talking about with Gary was in the team, again, so high-performing teams, take a pause and have a really good, deep discussion about what's going on and how we should tackle crises or anything else for that matter. Because otherwise we're just running at 100 miles all the time. And ultimately, that's not, I'm not saying stop, lie down in some dark corner and not do anything. Of course not. That wouldn't be realistic. But you do need those more reflective, deeper conversations. The authenticity piece plays in because team leaders have a role in role modeling the behavior they want in their team. One of the things I hear a lot is a team leader will say, I ask an open question in my team and the usual suspects speak up, and it's not a general conversation. The issue is you haven't created sufficient comfort for people to have fulsome conversations. And as Gary and I were sort of saying, teams actually need more conflict of the right type, more conflict around ideas, different perspectives, and let's kick it around as much as possible, not some kind of artificial harmony or groupthink where we all pretend that we're all on the same page and then go off and do something different. Authenticity, the leader goes first, role model the behaviors you want in your team, and don't pretend that you've got all the answers all of the time.
Yeah.
I do my best work when I'm kicking around ideas with more than one person in the client. I'm rubbish. If they expect me to figure it all out by myself, it's going to be rubbish. It's much better that sort of collaborative, let's think it through together. You get a much better result. And I think we're so busy at work that maybe sometimes we don't do that enough.
Yeah. It's this metaphor. I don't know why it's come up recently for me a lot. I think it's an African proverb. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And this is exactly what you're saying,
Yeah.
in like getting people in a room to workshop, brainstorm a solution, or even just to define what the problem actually is. This is something that I do quite a lot in my work. We've reached an obstacle. I'm not going to sit here and say, this is what we're going to do. We're going to get together, pool our collective hive mind and create something together. And it goes back to that authenticity in leadership. It's not that I'm going to come up with this idea and it's going to make me look great. You're going to look great to yourself. But
Yeah.
if you're collaborating with people and asking for help, people feel more involved, people feel more invested, relationships grow, creativity is cultivated.
Yeah.
And that all stems from, let's take a moment here, come together and move forward together, rather than the old fashioned view of boss knows everything, leadership leads without consulting anybody else. So I think that's also something that's come through in this season. The individual leader is almost like a thing of the past.
The hero leader, that ended when Moses was still a baby in the crib floating down the River Jordan. Maybe several leaders have not heard that message. The hero leader is died years ago. That's not how you get the best out of people. If anybody did a case study on collaboration or kicking ideas around to come up with a product or an idea, both sides or however many people are involved are fully committed, energized, and really want to go there. I think working with you on this, on the sort of giving birth, forgive that analogy, to this podcast series, not this, both series, season 1 and season 2.
You clearly disliked the hero leader model, and you didn't want to be like the leader even in the podcast episodes. You wanted it always to be conversational and to be everybody's at the same level here. And that came through quite early in our conversations about it, that you didn't want to be like the star of the show. The creative process is a beautiful thing. I think a lot of people can go through their careers and follow a process in this company and a process in that company and are onboarded here and onboarded there and take little pieces from here and there. And they don't realize that over time, they're developing a creative
Yeah,
process. I'm completely biased because creativity is one of the most important things in my life. It guides a lot of the work that I do. A creative process can be how you cook a meal, how you put your Christmas tree together, how you design your family holiday. And you don't realize it, but it's being built there. And once you become aware of it, it can feed into how you lead. It can feed into how you approach problem solving, tuning into it, taking a pause, tuning into what that means and what you need to get into a creative flow. It's important to acknowledge that and to spend time noticing it, because it's a great asset to you in many parts of your life. And this is something that I think that I've pushed you on. It's that you've seen, like a lot of people that I work with will have seen a process, or they've taken a course and they're following that procedure that somebody else, it works for somebody else. But it's only by tuning into what works for you personally, then you can keep it, that it's sustainable. I think now
I
in season
agree.
2, you know your creative process and you're going, well, this works for me. I've tried it the other way that was recommended by this article that I read, but it's only by kind of finding your own creative process that it's sustainable and repeatable.
I think those last 2 points I think are critical. Is this notion of it becomes habitual? This is the way that I'm going to continue working. The bit before, the piece of the jigsaw puzzle before, which again you've mentioned and speaks directly to Deirdre's podcast, is you really need to have. People say, "Oh, I know me." Do you know what? Most people don't know themselves that well, actually,
Yeah.
unless you've gone through some counseling or therapy. The connection with the pause button is that you just need to take a moment, just a moment to go, how am I thinking about this thing or this crisis or this thing that I'm working with? Because as Deirdre said, we've all got unconscious biases.
Mm.
And sometimes they can really get in the way of you operating as the best version of yourself in your context as a leader or as a creator, whatever. And it's having that sort of self-awareness, or at least turn up the dial a bit on the self-awareness, so that you just don't take it as read all the time, that you know exactly what the next best thing to do is, and having that curiosity or question mark hanging over you a little bit and saying, hold on a minute, is there another way of looking at this? Because that adaptability and that moment of pause, usually you get a much better answer. What Julie was saying is, don't let the little voice in your head saying that you've got to be perfect and have all the knowledge get in the way. One thing that stood out for me, which I thought was brilliant, where she said, we talk about confidence and self-confidence, and actually all you need is enough,
Mhm.
enough to get past this next bit. Maybe in a couple of weeks you've got some more, but you just need enough self-confidence to move on. And I think that's a great point, because I'm sure with you, I, and loads of people I speak to have got loads of examples of the hero leader that reckons they know, they're the last word on their particular subject, and it doesn't exist. In fact, that leads us directly to Joe Wright's
Yeah.
episode where we were talking about, is it possible to eradicate rubbish managers? She's got a brilliant book. I love the title, and the title is No More Shit Managers. And basically, he was saying that this sort of command and control thing, I'm right, just do as I say, that went out with the arc. And
Yeah.
people don't want to work for managers like that. So self-awareness, understanding self, engaging with others, co-creating, figuring out problems together always gets you a great working environment, a collaborative team producing great stuff together.
I think that sums it up beautifully, as in take a pause. I think that can be represented by just a little 30 minutes every other week. So if the listener would like to take the invitation, take a pause, listen to Gobbo, and you can agree or disagree. We'd love to hear your insights on LinkedIn. Come and connect with Joe there to continue the conversation. Joe, it's a beautiful second season. I think there's more conversations to be had. And we look forward to having everybody join the conversation as the episodes come out every other week.
The more the merrier. Thanks so much, Claire.
Thanks, Joe.
So there you have it. So much to talk about and so little time. My thanks to all my guests and of course to Claire. I hope your ideas are sparked and thoughts provoked. All the episodes of Gobbo somehow connect with each other. So give us a like if you enjoyed this trailer. Leave a comment. We'd love to know your thoughts. Or perhaps suggest topics that you'd like to hear discussed. Share and spread the word about Gobbo. And see you on the next episode. Until next time, bye for now.